Great, and it looks like we are live. Hi, I'm Daz Greenwood, a scientist at the MIT Media Lab and one of the co-chairs, and happy to be a co-host of next week's World Wide Web Consortium Blockchain Workshop to talk about prospects and possibilities for standards with the blockchain. And with me is co-chair Daniel Buckner, who I wanted to introduce to maybe just provide a little bit of an update of where things are at now with the conference planning. And I know we had a program committee call last week, which unfortunately I wasn't able to join. And maybe if could you maybe just bring people up to speed a little bit on where things are at with the schedule, and then soon we'll get to one of our program committee members and someone who'll be presenting, I think, on one of the topics. And so I'll do that introduction in a moment. And Daniel, take it
Sure.
away.
Yeah, so last week we talked a little bit about everyone being invited, a last call to make sure registrations were in. We also took a look at scoring the requests for speaking. So those were tabulated by you, Daza. And over the weekend and just yesterday, we were able to actually pare that list down. And I think we have a full rank sorted list of the topics of interest. So I think that's going to help inform basically, the layout of the talks. But those people, we said we had room for at least 20 to 25 minimum during the official hours of the workshop. And I'm sure that we can get pretty much everyone on the list if we started including, off social time, after the break at 5 p.m. the first night or whatever that is. We could accommodate that at some other location. So um, yeah, I think we made good progress there, and we have a clear sense of what we're going to be discussing.
Okay, great. And so speaking of what we're going to be discussing, um, I wanted to take the opportunity with this Hangout to start to set the table a little bit with respect to the topics. And so as you said, there was ratings and rankings, and one of the topics that came out pretty strong, I think, was yours, Daniel. And then we're also going to hear about security in a moment. And but what could you get us started by just describing what it is that you've proposed? That people reacted so well to with the ratings, and how you could see this approach toward identity um, ripening eventually into potentially as something that could be standardized by the W3C. Like, what is the problem statement, and what is the approach to standardization on blockchain that you're proposing?
Yeah, so I think as you stated, you could see through the rankings, the proposal that I had as well as other people, it really lines up around identity, and it really takes over kind of those top few rankings. And I think what's important there is understanding why it's so important to W3, because as a standard that's very personal to the user, it's important that we hit on identity in the browser because it's a user agent, right? And what we're talking about is agency. And so what's really unique about the blockchain in this sense is that for the very first time, really effectively in history, we've had a distributed system that allows ownership of an identity, but then can also be the source of indices for those identities. And one source that you can look at with, and securely know that you're finding the right identity, you're finding the right person that matches that identity. And we just really haven't had that before in a decentralized, user sovereign way. So I would say that when it comes to what do we standardize? Well, I don't think you actually have to have awareness of all the inner guts of every blockchain to do that. And I think folks like Blockstack have done a really good job of sort of taking care of that in an application layer that I would liken to an implementers layer. Everyone may implement focusing and input slightly differently in code, but if the output is recognition of an identity that's tied to a public-private key that you look in one place for, you can have that other layer do the rest of the work for you. So I think that's the crux of what we'd like to see the body huddle around and understand as a possible standards opportunity. And it really unlocks a ton of stuff for the other sub-standards that are within W3 that might touch on security, privacy, um, a whole host of
Got
other
it.
things.
Um, and it actually looks like we're joined by Marta. Is that right?
Yeah. Hmm.
Yep, it's Martha.
Hi, hi, Marta. Hi, could you introduce yourself, please?
I'm from Blockstream. I've been working on the privacy of blockchain, and I'm the security architect in Blockstream, working with Christopher Allen, and working a bit on like identity on blockchain and applications of blockchain other than Bitcoin.
Great. And I had a sort of a form to for folks that wanted to talk about proposals or problem statements, um, and I knew that Daniel had something to say, and so did Shinichiro. I maybe I didn't check the form enough, or maybe it came in through a different channel. But I wanted to check: was there something that you wanted to propose by way of a prospective standard or problem statement as part of the Hangout, or was it
Ye-
more you wanted maybe just a chance to discuss and feedback or something else?
Okay, so I would like to propose one thing about the security and trust. And so on the web-oriented blockchain standards, we should be aware of trust of each entity and node. The trust comes from the technologies components we used, operational environment, and operational policy of each node. Sharing this information about the trust among the blockchain-based web services is needed to establish trustable services over blockchain. At the W3C, the possible standardization items are the ontologies, analysis framework, interfaces, so message format, and protocol. I think it needed both for nodes and client. And W3C needs collaboration with external experts on security and trust. It may include other security-related standardization organizations like CFROG in IRTF, and so group of security experts like Mozilla Foundation. So the possible discussion topics are which organizations are appropriate and how to establish liaisons and invited experts. And so WCC also needs communication with external research communities. And we should also discuss on joint work with WebCrypt, web application security, and web authentication. There are the existing activities in WCC.
Yeah, I actually agree with that. So, and I think that's what when we talk about identity, it really does hit on all those things. And internally at Microsoft, I know there was a tumultuous period where people were trying to understand how this fit into a lot of work that was long-standing, like FIDO and web authentication.
Yeah.
And so at first it looked like, oh, this thing was going to come in and somehow disrupt everything that was going on, when really I think a lot of those specs can benefit here, because all we're introducing is the idea that there's this place that has the source of truth of identity tokens, and then they link to identities however they choose. And as long as we can inform the browser where to look and how to receive that data, it can then plug into existing standards like the WebAuth standard, FIDO flows. A lot of those are, WebAuth is pretty generic. It can be modded to accommodate this, and then things like FIDO are more almost flows. So I don't think any of those go away. It was interesting. I'll point out we talked to a company, Case, which makes form factors for key security in the Bitcoin space and for authentication, stuff like that. They have this interesting new form factor that they're going to be putting out pretty soon, this fall sometime. And we started talking about auth flows with them and what we could do with this identity layer. And when you pair their form factor with a system like this, we started getting into all sorts of new territory where someone could walk up to an untrusted computer with a browser, and they could essentially use this form factor and just touch a machine, and instantly be asked if they'd like to log in as a guest session for Twitter, if they're like on a Twitter website. They don't type any passwords. It's implicit that they're logging in, time bounded. Like all these interesting things become possible, and that has to feed into security standards at some point.
Good. And so I'm wondering, what do you think would be the most fruitful aspects of security that we could begin to get our minds around at the workshop? And so, some of this is a little bit complicated by the fact that we're dealing with a fast evolving, kind of early stage technology with blockchain generally in the new market. And so I wonder, like, what would be the best level of abstraction and sort of approach to size up and scope security as part of a potential standards conversation in view of the moving pieces.
Okay, so my opinion is that as you said that the technology itself is so rapidly growing, and so I think that the current technology is not mature enough from the security perspective, but from the W3C perspective, so we can discuss about how to share the information about the security or vulnerability, and how we can convince the trust of the services.
Yeah, one really specific way to do that, and so when we talk about these identities, right? Just imagine that you have an identifier, let's say Dan.id, and I can look that up in a central place, and I can say, okay, it's out there, it's decentralized, but I have this indice. So Dan.id, here's the profile that goes along with that. Here's the identity data that's public. If I get an attestation on that profile, like two identities, myself and Daza, we've come together and we've attested to something, and I present that to a website with that attestation, which is essentially just a signed piece of data that has been signed by our two private keys. It would be nice if the browser, in a standards way with like one function, I could go retrieve one of those attestations, run it through the function, and say, was this actually signed by these two identities that it's claiming? And I put in maybe the string Daza.id and Dan.id, and the browser is then able to resolve with some of the things that might be in web crypto already. Yes, this is in fact, this is in fact attested by these parties. That would be like a really specific thing that we could add.
Right, and just picking up on that, I noticed, Shinichiro, that you had identified CP and CPSs from the IETF as one possible example of how the sharing of information.
So you know that the CP or CPS is a framework, trust framework for certificate authority. But so we can start considering about the trust framework for blockchain. That's I think that the identity problem is a good example, and also certificate authority problem is a good example, and we can start the discussion from that.
Yes, and so thank you. I wanted to highlight, I thought that was great. I'm glad that we're having an opportunity to share some ideas before we actually get there cold. For me anyway, about thinking about what could be standardized on blockchain. It's a new question. It's not had a lot of treatment before, and you really gave me something to think about from the IETF certificate policy and certificate practice statement. For those of you who should be thankful you're uninitiated into that somewhat arcane set of PKI standards. And what it is fundamentally, as we just highlighted, is a way to, in a standard way, describe some business, but mostly legal and technical aspects of how a certification authority is like minting its certificates and enrolling people, and what crypto it's using, how it's dealing with revocation list and things like that. That would be the type of stuff that we'd have to communicate for what Daniel's suggesting, which is if eventually someone had to revoke or kind of migrate to a new key due to a compromise. In principle, people that have added attributes to their old public key could find a way to agree that here's the new public key associated with a re-key, private key of this person. But how they do that is still up in the air, I think, in terms of commercial practices and standard approaches. And so I could imagine beginning to think about how to communicate, things like migrations and transition points, and life cycle events would make a lot of sense, and it has a heavy security dimension, because that's one of the places that when there's a transition where things can be most vulnerable after all. So I see, by the way, that we've been joined by our erstwhile chair and convener, Doug, of the W3C, and I just wanted to say welcome, and also ask you, if you, Daniel, did the service of at a high level, just saying that we're beginning to hone topics and format issues, but was there any other announcements or updates that you could share, or anything else about the workshop? Please do, and welcome.
Okay, thank you. That's great. So just to briefly talk about to touch on what you guys were just talking about, rather. A lot of what you were saying is blockchain-related stuff, but in terms of whether that's something that would be of interest or would be relevant to W3C standards, which of course are only a subset of web standards and internet standards, I think finding the intersection there, finding out what would need to be done from the web side, from the client side client side aspect, that's really where I'm hoping the sweet spot is for the workshop itself, and for anything to do with W3C going forward. It could be that there's lots of forums to discuss these things, but if we're going to be talking about standardization in general, it needs to include more than W3C, and so that might be something we try to do going forward, is to find out which pieces fit where, and how to coordinate between those different organizations or projects in order to make sure that the different pieces are interoperable.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that I always had a question on, this maybe Doug knows this, the intersection between semantic data structures and validation of those structures. So I know that in some places in the web there is loose validation of certain data structures that you form in HTML or other micro formats. And I'm curious, with this blockchain identity stuff that we're going after, the folks in Microsoft now understand that probably the largest piece of this whole puzzle is actually getting everyone to speak the same language when it comes to your identity. I can describe a couch object in one way, but if I describe it in one way and everyone else has 100 different ways of describing it, it's not going to be able to be shown in a browser or in an agent very well and predictably. So I'm curious about how that works. Do we have data format verification standards currently, a section for that, or?
Well, so that's a complicated question, and there's a lot of different pieces to what you mean by validation. There is something called JSON LD, which is part of the sort of, I guess, the semantic web stack, more of the modern aspect of the semantic web stack, and that's there's some coordination is the wrong word, but there's some overlaps between that and what schema.org is doing, for example, and so depending on how we want to mark things up and how we want to interchange things, there's lots of different ways of going about this. But one of the things that W3C does is that we focus on testing. So we have defined formats in the past, and we focus on basically regression testing and automated testing for those resources to make sure that people are following along the right schema. There's also what we're using actually for validation of these things is a variation on JSON schema. So probably any interchange message would be in JSON, and optionally in JSON LD. That's not required, but some people would like that. And then in terms of validation, you could look at it from the point of view of tests. You could look at it from the point of view of specifications to make sure that people are on the same page about what are the useful parts of a schema and how of a data format, and how to coordinate with others on that. And then there's also things like services that we could stand up, like a validator, just like people can validate their HTML. You could validate your schema you could validate the output from your API or from your implementation, and see where it's predictable and where it's not. And I agree, interoperability, predictability is actually a really big aspect of interoperability. And so we can coordinate on a lot of different aspects. The data area is actually sort of a different part of W3C than I've normally worked in. And there's different organizations within, or not organizations, but different focuses within W3C. And there's the data part, and then there's a client-side web part. And those two don't overlap very much, but it might be that blockchain could benefit from some aspects of both of those. Mm-hmm. Going back to Daz's original question, I apologize for the discursion. By the end of the day today, I will have, I think, the final list for of the attendees. When I say final, you know, there's an asterisk next to that, because there will be people who don't show. There will be people, even though they verified, there will be people who show up thinking that they verified that we never heard from. There will be maybe even people who show up at the last minute and say, "Oh, I heard about this workshop. Can we come in?" So the ultimate list will be in the workshop report that we produce after the workshop. But by the end of the day today, I'm hoping to have the final schedule, or at least some form of the final schedule, up. And I think the most notable thing is that in our discussions about the schedule, we decided that identity and provenance are two key underlying ideas that are going to be touched on in a lot of different aspects of blockchain. And so we're going to try to put those on day one, so we get those out of the way, so that any other things that that would touch on those, we don't have to defer those conversations. We can already have had the conversations about the ideas of identity and provenance, and that will serve as a backdrop for the rest of the day. In terms of structure, here's what we plan. We're going to have a keynote by Arvind from Princeton, and he is an expert in these areas, and I'm very much looking forward to him to his discussion, or his talk. And we're going to have a little bit of W3C things, some things around how the workshop itself is going to be scheduled, and also about the backdrop of existing technologies that W3C is going to be working on. And then we're going to go into lightning talks, and the basic structure is a set of lightning talks on a general topic, and then a set of breakouts where people explore those individual topics. So different tables will be talking about different things. And then after we discuss those, those are going to be facilitated by the individual organizers of that topic. And then we're going to have, hopefully we're also going to have a scribe for each of those things as well. A scribe is just somebody to take notes. And then we'll come back to the plenary session after each breakout, and people will report back on the results of the workshop, of their breakout, and then we'll rinse and repeat. We'll just keep doing that same structure. On the second day, we're going to have a summary around 3 o'clock. We're going to start wrapping things up around 3 o'clock, or 2:30, 3 o'clock. We're going to start having summaries of the zeitgeist of the whole workshop, and then after 3:30, we're going to have more of an open session, just open talk. I know some people have to leave before that time to get back to Europe in time, but there'll be some of us left behind, and we're going to formally end at 3:30, but we're going to have a loose discussion from 3:30 till 5:30. That's the sort of the structure of the workshop, and Blockstream has actually been very generous in providing a graphic facilitator, and so the graphic, or a graphic scribe rather, And so this person is going to be listening to all the plenary sessions and making diagrams and other things to help us sort of come to a shared understanding, other images to help us come to a shared understanding of what we're trying to do and what we have talked about. And then those things will be part of the workshop report as well. We'll sort of integrate those images in to let people get a sense better of what it was like to be at the workshop and sort of the thought process that went into things.
Great. Thank
I
you.
hope that wasn't...
No, that was very good. I just want to recognize Shinichiro. First of all, thank you for contributing the ideas and joining us. And I'm aware that you're timing out now about 3:30 Eastern time, and that you need to go. So I just wanted to recognize that you, whatever, didn't lose your signal or kind of get bored. But anyway, I understand you're leaving, and also to genuinely say, very grateful for the contributions, the thoughtful contribution you made. It's certainly going to help me as I get ready for the workshop to start to have a chance to digest and think through what we'll talk about.
Okay.
So I look forward to seeing you back at the lab next week.
Thank you. See you next week.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Great. Okay, and I believe that Marta would like to say a few words too on an idea. And let me just check to see, Marta, if you can hear us. Right
Sure.
now, you're great on mute. And is this good timing? Do you want to?
Yeah,
Great.
I'll try being quite brief. I'm actually on Prince Edward Island right now, in the middle of nowhere, so my internet might be pretty flaky. So bear with me if you can't hear me. This is an idea that I've been discussing with both Doug and some other people. It connects to identity, it connects to a bunch of other things. Basically, the thing that I'm very tempted with is, or a thing that I've realized is that something that has not been possible before introduction of blockchain technology is tracking to your private data when you go online. Once you go online and today, you completely lose control of your private data. You submit forms, they disappear. It can no longer you can claim ownership of your data. With blockchain, however, it would be possible to somehow color or watermark data and say, this piece I have shared with this third party, and the blockchain technology and the hash function and hash addresses and all of that, we could track which information or which copy or which version of my data has been connected or shared with whom, and which version has been possibly abused online, right? So, to give you an example, if I share the same information about my account with Google, with Amazon, and with Facebook, and then Amazon, Google, and Facebook share this information with advertisement company A, B, and C, and company B abuses this information, I can go say, well, it was Amazon that sold my information to the company B, and company abused that information, so I can hold accountable Amazon for transacting with an untrusted company. Although it was the same information, the version of it is watermarked in a way. And this is something that I think is extremely tempting. I'm not sure how, put it in technical terms, but I think a standard around that, when using blockchain for that, is something extremely interesting and kind of brainstorming around on the during the workshop of how to put it in good technical terms is very good. Also, it gives incentive to the big players, the companies, because now they no longer have the responsibility of take care of the data, because they can transact based on accessing the data. So they don't have to feel, or they don't have to be held responsible or accountable for taking care of the data. They can just take pieces of information from the user and not pack the data, or the responsibility is much lower in that case, because they can prove that nothing has been abused.
Got it. Very innovative. Thank you for sharing that. May I ask, oh, somebody just wrote, can I follow on that?
Oh,
And
that's Doug.
okay, great. The answer is yes. And I'll just make one quick observation, which is there was a company that collaborated with research, crypto research I'd done at MIT like 15 years ago, I think, and I'll dig out their name for you, but they had a patent on a kind of steganography that allowed for the sort of basically unique, like just hiding little messages and unique versions of things like books and photographs and movies and other media objects, so that you could tell kind of like which version of it under which contract or distribution agreement or something was the one where there was potentially an issue with it being basically the kind of shenanigans that you're just talking about. Let me see if I can find that, and I'll email it to you. But I have to say it was very fruitful, and one of the issues I thought with using steganography, other than the technical issues of needing enough data to hide the messages in, was really just having like some sort of public registry of where you could publicly verify what the versions were, just a bit easier, as opposed to have to necessarily take people to court, and the enforcement of that was not necessarily so easy. Perhaps blockchain could provide this sort of shared ledger where versioning of property, digital property, could happen at scale, and could be more preventative dispute resolution or kind of enforcement, perhaps much more efficiently as a result of the new capabilities of this technology. So very inventive, ingenious idea there, and I look forward to thinking more about that as we head towards the workshop. And yeah, Doug, did you want to follow on?
Yeah, there were just two other things that might not be immediately obvious in terms of implications from what Marta was saying, and one of them is your social media interactions. A lot from marketing, and I know this is something people hate to think about or talk about, except people who are in marketing, but being able to track the impressions that you have for your content as it makes its way through the web is actually a really interesting question and problem. Information propagation and then reaggregation of results is actually really interesting. But for me, and I think that's actually quite interesting. I'd like to see. I'm always fascinated to see where things that I've written pop up, and I'd like to see if there's some way of making that easier for people to do.
Yeah, we're actually, Doug, we're actually working on that exact thing with a partner right now. Very making sure that the ad exchanges don't have your, too much of your data, and being able to understand one individual impression object as it makes its way from the seller to the exchange to the purchaser and then to the eventual render, so that we start getting a better handle on where all this stuff is going and who has it.
Yeah, and along with that, the problem of freebooting. Somebody puts a video on YouTube and they actually make money off of ad impressions on YouTube, and a lot of people make a living off of just from creating content in a really ad hoc way, and then somebody takes their video and cuts out the credits and puts it on Facebook and gets 10 times the number of impressions, 10 times the number of views, impressions, I'm sorry, gets 10 times the number of views, but the person who made the content doesn't get compensated for that. And honestly, that's just not fair. I'd love to see a way for people to be compensated more for their contributions, because increasingly, we don't go through distributors for contributions. People manage it themselves, and I think that's a really powerful possible model for how people make money in the future. And going along with something like that, if people can make a living by doing those things, if the web can facilitate people making money in these ad hoc ways, there's actually less need for ads and for collecting privacy information, because because a website, you might pay a website directly. Now, this isn't blockchain. This is sort of web payments stuff we're getting into. But you might pay a tenth of a cent to a website rather than see the ads, and then you don't have the ads. They get compensated, but you don't have the ads on your phone. It doesn't eat your bandwidth up. It's not annoying. But the thing I think is the most interesting, and possibly might have the biggest impact from what Marta is saying, might have the biggest impact on the world, is that scientists currently lock their data away because they're afraid of somebody using it and not giving them credit. So a lot of really important studies the data is not available on the web because it is a credit-based, or it's a merit-based system. Science is. You get grants and other things based on the things that you've contributed. And if somebody takes your research and reinterprets it in a different way, they may well lock you out of the credit. You made the data, you did all the hard work, but they evaluated it or interpreted it a certain way, and they get credit for that. And the scientist might be afraid that they won't get the due credit. And so if data were if there were a way of watermarking and marking data and social expectations around that, we could have a renaissance of release of data on the web, which could revolutionize science.
Yeah, I think one interesting thing there is, and that could help is, and I don't know for sure if this would be a solution, but to look at homomorphic encryption and saying, like, if you encrypted a container that contained a video, and to play it, it was a multi-signature contract, essentially, just a regular Bitcoin transaction that would wrap it, where you had to pay into it, and it was tied to your blockchain identity. Then, the only way to essentially have that container play its content would be to pay in and have it come from your identity. So that might be one way to go about doing that. That would be interesting. It's hard because you always, with like documents, you always suffer the problem of, if someone even paid in and to view something, I guess you could screenshot it, which is not as fun if it's like a video, because then you end up with, probably, unless the person's really, really good and, capturing the stream. But yeah, there's ways to do it, I think, that capture like value for the 99% of people viewing it that will actually pay and do the right thing. So yeah, I think there's ways in that it can work into blockchain.
Yeah.
And
so just I'm sorry to deepen a little bit here. Your underlying your comment is a sense of identity and a sense of ownership, like together, right?
Yeah.
It's important to know that the financial people who have really propelled much of the blockchain development thus far with the ledger, like traditional ledger uses, have broken through from GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles, right to contracts, ownership, and ownership rights and exchange rights, and a few other legal concepts, and something called FIBO, IBO, which is being advanced through Open Management Group and looked at very seriously as a structured format that is that may be the type of primitive almost, where you could put together between ownership, contract terms, property rights, identity, a very, very strong case for a web standard that could begin to put pieces together so that people can track their property and exchange it without being ripped off. And I just want to ask you, Doug, in your next comment, if you could speak to a little hack that I've done with some students, which is we use archive.org for like almost everything now in our research projects. You talked about science and sharing. So here, an example is every day or every week example for me is putting data sets and other reports and other research, copies of it on archive.org so we can find it again. And I use the key value pairs that they just make available for metadata on everything that you upload to archive.org for everything, basically, so that we can find, sort, filter, search, use the provenance depending on the funder, whatever it is that we need. Key value pairs are very flexible. What if there was a way to back up my science and back up my media, maybe like containers, along the lines that Daniel said, onto systems like archive.org? And then what if there's standard metadata to describe an address on a blockchain and connect it back to either property type or a media object, a resource somewhere? Could that be one of the ways that you could begin to put pieces together so that we've got, locations where data can reside? I'm saying archive.org is an example of that on the web where I put my science. And then some is maybe standard metadata where there's a way to understand you have to connect a blockchain address, a URL or something to where the data is, I think, and then also a more supple way to describe identity and ownership rights so that we can begin to get the chains of provenance. If you could just think, you don't have to respond right now, we can respond at the conference, but I want to say that's what I was thinking a little bit as I heard both of you talking about this vision, and it's a very real everyday problem right now for the sharing of results and not really being able to know, not just for attribution, most of our stuff is free, but just to know who's working on what and just to be able to have buildable science. Anyway, I interdicted you, Mr. Chairman. You have the floor.
I think what you said is really interesting. Discoverability is an enormous problem on the web. Tracking where something came from, even like all of these things are big issues. As you said, identity, provenance, delegation, all of these things are larger issues. And I want to say first off that I'm as guilty of this as anybody. At the workshop, we want to actually be more focused on the concrete things that would enable these use cases. These use cases are fantastic. This is what we want to be able to achieve. This is probably not what we're going to go in depth on at the workshop itself. I hope what the workshop does, I mean, if we had a workshop on HTML and we talked about all the things you could use HTML for, that would be a very disorganized conference.
Be a long workshop.
It'd be a long workshop. And so I don't want to put people off and think, oh, this workshop is not going to be focused. Actually, we're going to be try to be quite focused at the workshop about concretely what are the pieces that we need to enable these use cases. And we were all going a little, getting excited and thinking, oh, what could we do once we have this functionality? From a standards perspective, I'm most interested in making sure that we can enable people to be creative and to do these sorts of things on the web. And that's what we're really going to focus on at the workshop. Use cases are fantastic and they're aspirational and inspirational, but bringing it back down to, is there a specific API? Is there a specific data format that we need to standardize? Is there some piece of functionality that's client-side in a browser, some sort of wallet thing, or is there something that we built into a browser, for example, that would enable all these different use cases? That's the sort of focus that I want to have at the conference. And now, just to get a little more, jump back on our use case, and I realize I'm cognizant that we're coming up on the top of the hour, but one thing I want to note about sharing data is in talking to scientists, I found out that most data, perhaps, that's being shared is actually not on the web, not because they're concerned with it, with who's using it, but because of the sheer size of the data and the complexity of, and just the bandwidth that it would require. They actually physically mail hard drives. FedEx, they ship hard drives to one another with data because we're talking about things on the terabyte scale, and I'm sure that there probably are already, and that in the future there will be high bandwidth, high throughput, real-time repositories, clouds for data that scientists use. And in preparation for that technological infrastructure, having standards that help us describe and find that data and share that data in a meaningful way. When I say share, I mean share the information about the data. Obviously, you wouldn't want to put this data on the blockchain, right? You would want to put some sort of pointer to this data, right? And on the blockchain, because the blockchain would quickly get way too big if you started putting real data on it.
And a fingerprint.
And a fingerprint, yes. All these things. And so these are all really interesting things, and I think that there's a lot to talk about in the coming months after the workshop as well. And that's the last thing I want to say is, if this workshop goes well, if people at the workshop feel like, hey, maybe there could be some web standards about this stuff, and if they think that it's timely to start those discussions, hopefully what we'll do is we'll form some sort of community group or use an existing community group at W3C perhaps, or find other fora elsewhere to keep these ideas going after the workshop and to keep this conversation going and to find what things are most fruitful and incubate those, get those to a state where we have general consensus and confidence in the functionality and confidence that we got the big parts right, and then we could actually talk about bringing those to standards. And so that's part of the larger conversation that should happen after the workshop. The workshop itself is just to put the ideas on the table and just to come to shared understanding about what might happen, and then in the months after that would be the time when we really drill into that.
Yeah, I'll let me throw out a teaser to so people can see stuff in action. But I've been working on a web extension using the new web extension standard stuff, so it'll run across all the browsers that support it, Edge, Chrome, Firefox, and right now we're going to sub in the true peer-to-peer ability soon. But right now I'm using OneName's API. But able to resolve in a browser tab when you put in like @dan.id, it will actually resolve against the blockchain identity and show you a profile, the profile data essentially associated with that. So if it's a person object, it detects that schema and says, okay, I'm going to show like a person page in Chrome page, or it'll show like another Chrome template of an IoT device. If it's a device, it looks a little different. It's more modulated towards interacting with device. And then we're going to be swapping out that API for the actual peer-to-peer endpoints soon. So very quickly you'll be able to see what it would actually be like if you could look these identities up in the browser. And I should have that by the 28th, so I can go show people what that next layer of the onion might look like in practice.
That's fantastic.
That would be cool. That is fantastic. Well, so some of the themes that we kind of surfaced were, identity again, expressing ownership and provenance, something that can assist with exchange, a fair value exchange at scale, including individuals. We talked about the need to be really looking toward APIs, formats, kind of structures of data, which is a sweet spot for W3C, and other themes as well, some innovative ideas and use cases that I hope that we'll be talking more about. And so that is there's a little bit of a whistle wetter, I guess, to as we get closer to the workshop. One thing I'd like to say is, with Doug's help, I have created a page on the workshop site. It's a /feedback, where you can see the ratings that Daniel referred to of the papers, and I just added in a form because we didn't get ratings from that many program committee members. We went from quite a few, and every paper was rated several times. But if you're on a program committee and you happen to hear of this, or if you check your email later today, it would be great to get even more of a show of like who thinks what is interesting as we get up to the workshop. So check out that feedback page. Just the Doug, I mean, I'm reluctant to touch the workshop page itself, but if you think it's okay, maybe you could put a link to it to make it easier to find that.
I will put a link to that on the page itself, right in the section on topics and position papers and expressions of interest.
Awesome. And then who knows, maybe we can learn more about Marta's, I'm just going to say ingenious idea. It's like peanut butter and chocolate, putting individual ownership of personal data together with the vast global capabilities of the blockchain for public verification. And then maybe, I don't know, Daniel, if we can get a sneak peek of your thing, whatever, bring it. So program committee members, collaborate and share and communicate. I'd love to learn more as we lead up to the workshop. So I and I'm sure other committee members as well can bring our best game and really be considering what your ideas are.
Yeah, I'll get it out by Wednesday. I'll try and get it out or Tuesday, I'm sorry.
Oh, excellent. Okay, you heard it here. Tuesday, I'm going to put that in the blockchain. So thanks very much, everybody. We look forward to seeing you in person at the MIT Media Lab next week. And until then, wishing you very well. So bye-bye now.
Thank you.
Bye, all.
Thanks.
Bye.